There is a version of you that has never existed anywhere in the physical world, and yet it has been quietly running your life for years. Not a memory, not a dream, a pattern, a signal you locked in so long ago that you stopped noticing it was ever a choice. And the strangest morning of my life was the one when I realized that everything I thought was happening to me, I had been selecting, not consciously, not on purpose, but with the full, silent authority of someone who had already decided how the story ends. And I want to tell you exactly how I figured that out, because once you hear it, you will not be able to unhear it. And that is the whole point. I was sitting at my kitchen table, coffee going cold in the mug, staring at a message on my phone that I had somehow already known was coming. Not because I had information, because somewhere in the way I had been watching my life, I had already written that scene. And it landed exactly as expected. No shock, just this hollow, exhausted recognition, like finishing a book you read once before and forgot you hated. And that is the moment something cracked open for me. Not the message itself, the fact that I had already felt it before it arrived. Because here is the thing nobody tells you. Your reality does not form around what happens to you. It forms around what you are observing, what you keep your attention tuned to, what you quietly, automatically, constantly expect. And those expectations, they are not neutral. They are weighted. They are loaded with years of emotional evidence. With every time something went sideways, every time you told yourself, well, that figures. And that weight is what makes them so precise. Because the universe does not respond to what you want. It responds to what you are broadcasting. And most of us have been broadcasting the same signal at full volume since we were teenagers. I remember walking out of that kitchen and standing in the hallway for probably 3 full minutes doing nothing, just standing there, because something about that moment felt different from every other time I had been disappointed or stuck or frustrated. It felt deliberate, not like something had gone wrong, but like something had gone exactly right, exactly according to a plan I had made without knowing I was making it. And that realization was not comfortable. It was the opposite of comfortable, but it was the first honest thing I had felt in a long time. And honesty, even when it is painful, has a certain weight to it that feels like solid ground after years of standing on something soft. If any of this is landing for you, stay with me, because we are just getting started. And if you want more content like this, take 2 seconds and subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps more than you know. So let me tell you how the system actually works, because once you see the mechanics, you cannot unsee them. Think of it like this. There is a loop running inside you right now. It is not a metaphor. It is not a spiritual idea. It is a functional circuit. The way you interpret something shapes what you believe about it. What you believe shapes what you expect next time. What you expect next time shapes how you behave, and how you behave shapes the outcome you get. And that outcome feeds right back into the original interpretation, confirming it, deepening it, making it feel more true than it did before. And the whole thing runs automatically, quietly, completely beneath the level of conscious thought, like a program running in the background of a computer you forgot you turned on. The terrifying part is not that the loop exists. The terrifying part is how reasonable it feels while it is happening. Every step of it makes perfect sense from the inside. Of course you expected that. Look at what happened last time. Of course you held back. Why would this be any different? Of course it ended that way. It always does. Each thought sounds like wisdom. Each thought sounds like experience protecting you. But it is not protection. It is a recording. And you have been mistaking the recording for reality so long that the two have become almost impossible to tell apart. Almost. Because there was that morning at the kitchen table, and something in me, some part that was tired of the recording, finally noticed the difference. And once you notice, the whole thing starts to shake. The moment I traced the loop back to its actual starting point, I felt sick. Not dramatic, not metaphorical, physically sick, like something cold dropped through the center of my chest. Because it was not a tragedy that had created it. It was not some defining catastrophe or a terrible thing someone had done to me. It was a sentence. One quiet, unremarkable sentence I had said to myself somewhere around the age of 17, sitting on the edge of a bed in a room that smelled like old carpet and cheap deodorant, staring at a rejection letter from the first thing I had ever genuinely wanted. And the sentence was this: some things just are not meant for people like me. That was it. That was the whole origin. 7 words that I never questioned, never examined, never even remembered consciously until that morning in the hallway, when the whole structure of my life suddenly looked like it had been built around them. And the brutal part is how normal it felt to believe that. It did not feel like a limitation. It felt like wisdom. It felt like I was being realistic, not pessimistic. Like I was protecting myself from the particular kind of pain that comes from wanting something too much and not getting it. But what I was actually doing was writing the script for every significant moment that came after. Every time I held back just a little. Every time I downgraded the goal before I had even tried. Every time something good showed up and I found a quiet, reasonable way to move away from it. I was not being careful. I was being consistent with a story I had locked in before I was old enough to understand what locking something in actually costs. Here is what makes this so hard to see in real time. The conclusions we draw about ourselves do not arrive with warning labels. They arrive as feelings, as instincts, as that gut sense that you already know how this is going to go. And because they feel like intuition, we trust them. We treat them as data. We let them inform decisions without ever asking where they came from or whether the evidence that created them still applies. The 17-year-old who wrote that sentence had one piece of data, one moment, one bad afternoon, and I had been governing a grown life with his verdict ever since. And here's the part that will stay with you. Every time you act on one of those old conclusions, even slightly, even in a small decision on a Tuesday afternoon, you are not just repeating a pattern, you are voting for it. You are casting a ballot that says, yes, this is still true, this is still who I am, this still applies. And reality, faithful and precise, counts every single vote. The recording does not just play, it accumulates authority with every repetition until the gap between the original conclusion and present reality becomes completely invisible. And by the time most people start asking why their life looks the way it does, the answer is so far back in the timeline that they stop looking before they find it. I almost did too, but something about that cold morning, that already felt message, that hollow recognition, it would not let me stop looking. And what I found next changed the way I understand everything, because I started paying attention to physics, not in an academic way, not in a textbook way, in a personal way, the way you pay attention to something when it suddenly feels like it is describing your life back to you in a language you had not expected. There is a principle in quantum mechanics that most people have heard of, and almost nobody has actually sat with long enough to let it get uncomfortable. And it goes like this. A particle does not have a fixed, definite position until it is observed. Before observation, it exists as a cloud of probabilities, a field of what could be. The moment you measure it, the moment you look, it lands. It becomes one specific thing out of all the things it could have been. And the act of looking is what makes it land. I remember reading that and having to put my phone down and stare at the ceiling for a while, because what that means, in the most literal and unsettling sense, is that observation does not just record reality, it participates in creating it. The measurement is not passive, it is generative, and if that is true at the level of particles, at the smallest scale of physical existence, then the question that immediately follows is this: what is it doing at the scale of a human life, with a human nervous system running decades of habitual, emotionally charged, deeply entrenched observation? What happens when the observer has already decided what they are going to see? What reality does a lens like that collapse into existence, morning after morning, year after year, with perfect and invisible consistency? And the answer, when I finally let it land, was not comfortable, but it was the most clarifying thing I had ever encountered. And we are not done yet. The cruelest thing I ever did to myself had nothing to do with a bad decision or a wrong turn. It was the act of wanting something so badly that the wanting itself became the problem. And I did not see it until I was standing in my kitchen one evening, not long after that hallway moment, watching water boil in a pot, and I had this sudden, almost physical awareness of how tense my whole body was. Not because anything was wrong in that specific moment, but because I had been in a state of low-grade urgency for so long that it had become my resting position. A constant internal hum of not yet, not enough, not there. And here is what I eventually understood about that hum. It was not motivation. It was static. And it was drowning out every signal that could have actually helped me move. Because wanting, real desperate wanting, does not feel like energy. It feels like pressure. And pressure has a direction. And that direction is always pointed at the gap between where you are and where you think you should be. And the moment your attention locks onto that gap with that kind of emotional charge, something subtle but powerful happens. You stop being available to what is already in the room. You stop noticing the thing that is quietly trying to reach you because you are too busy scanning for the thing you decided you need, and the loop tightens. Not because life is withholding from you, but because the frequency you are broadcasting is the frequency of absence. And like a radio stuck between stations, you get nothing clean, just noise. I thought about a friend of mine, someone I had known for years, who spent nearly a decade trying to force a particular version of his life into existence. Smart guy, genuinely talented, the kind of person who should have had things moving a lot sooner than they did. And he wanted it so intensely, talked about it constantly, structured every conversation around it, and nothing landed, not for years. And then one stretch of months when something shifted in him, when he got tired of the chase and just started doing the work without the desperation attached to it, things started arriving. Not because the universe rewarded his patience, but because he had finally stopped transmitting pure hunger and started transmitting something that had room in it. And room is what allows things to enter. I'm not saying stop caring. I am saying notice the texture of how you care, because there is a version of caring that is open and a version that is clenched, and clenched hands cannot receive anything. That distinction took me an embarrassingly long time to understand, and once I did, I looked back at every period of my life where nothing moved, and I could see it clearly. The wanting had been so loud, it had filled every available space. There was no room left for anything else to arrive. And this is where it connects directly back to the loop we have been talking about, because desperation is one of the most powerful forms of observation there is. It is a searchlight, and whatever you point a searchlight at in the dark, that is all you see. Everything outside the beam disappears, and you walk toward the beam, certain you are moving forward, not realizing you have been circling the same lit patch of ground for years. But here is what really stopped me cold when I started pulling this thread. The loop does not just live in the dramatic moments. It does not announce itself when you are making big decisions or standing at obvious crossroads. It lives in the invisible ones, in the micro moments that feel too small to count, but are actually doing most of the structural work. And this was the part that made everything click in a way I had not expected. I started paying attention to the texture of ordinary Tuesday afternoons, the way I would reach for my phone before I had even fully woken up, the way certain types of news or conversations would land in my body with a familiar heaviness, like a coat I had put on so many times, the shape of it had molded to my shoulders, the way I would walk into certain situations already braced, already loaded with an expectation so well worn it had no edges left. And I realized that none of this felt like a belief system. It felt like weather, like something that simply was, the way temperature simply is when you walk outside. And that is the deepest part of the trap. Not that the loop is loud, not that it is dramatic or obvious, or even particularly painful on any given day, but that it feels like the background condition of existence itself, like the hum of a refrigerator in a quiet room that you stopped hearing years ago, but that has been running constantly this whole time. The moment I actually heard it, really heard it, I could not believe how long it had been there, and I could not believe what it had been quietly powering all along. And that realization was about to take me somewhere I had not planned to go. The day I understood what identification actually costs, I was in the middle of a conversation with someone I trusted, and I said something I had said probably 100 times before. I said, "I am just someone who overthinks everything." And the person looked at me for a second and said, "Since when did that become a permanent address?" And I laughed it off in the moment, but that phrase stayed with me for days afterward, rattling around, bumping into things. Since when did that become a permanent address? Because that is exactly what had happened. At some point, the overthinking stopped being something I did and became something I was. And the distance between those two things is enormous. One is a habit you can change. The other is an identity you defend. And here is where the loop does its most sophisticated work. Because the moment you absorb something into your identity, your whole system reorganizes around protecting it, not because you want to stay stuck, but because the mind treats the self as something that must be kept consistent. Inconsistency feels like instability, and instability feels like a threat. So every time something happens that challenges your self-image, even in a positive direction, even when the challenge is actually an opportunity, the system pushes back. It looks for evidence that the old version was correct. It finds reasons to interpret new experiences through the old lens. And it does this so smoothly and so quickly that you experience it not as resistance, but as clear thinking. I noticed this in myself around the time a genuinely good thing was trying to happen in my professional life, something that aligned with what I had said I wanted. And instead of moving toward it with any kind of openness, I found myself mentally constructing reasons why it was probably not what it seemed, why there was likely a catch, why people like me should wait and see before getting invested. And none of that felt like self-sabotage. It felt like wisdom. It felt like I was protecting myself. But I was not protecting myself from a threat. I was protecting the loop from being interrupted, because the loop had become me, and threatening the loop felt like threatening my survival. That is the tipping point. That precise moment when I realized that the voice telling me to be careful, to hold back, to manage my expectations, was not the wise part of me. It was the defended part. The part that had decided long ago what kind of story this was and was now editing every new scene to fit the existing narrative. And once you see that, once you genuinely see it, you cannot keep mistaking that voice for guidance. It is not guidance, it is maintenance, and there is a massive difference between the two. So here's the part that confirmed everything. I made a deliberate change, not a massive dramatic overhaul, a small one. I took one situation where I could feel the old pattern activating, and I just did not follow it. I did not argue with it, did not analyze it into the ground. I simply moved differently than I would have before, and I watched what happened next with a level of attention I had not previously been capable of. And what happened was strange and uncomfortable and clarifying in equal measure, because the outcome was different. Not wildly, not instantly, but measurably, noticeably different. And that small difference was more disorienting than any failure I had ever experienced, because failure fits the loop. Failure confirms the story. But an unexpected, unearned, quiet success, that thing has nowhere to go inside a system built around limitation. And watching my own mind scramble to reinterpret it, to find a way to make it not count, to find the angle from which it still confirmed the old conclusion. That scramble was one of the most revealing things I have ever witnessed in myself. And this is exactly where the next layer of the problem opens up. Because even after all of this, even after the hallway, the quantum mechanics, the refrigerator hum, the defended identity, there was still a part of me that believed if I just changed my environment, things would finally be different. New place, new context, new cast of characters. Surely the loop could not follow me through a physical relocation. Surely geography was enough of a reset. And I want to tell you what actually happened when I tried that. Because what I found was not what I expected. And it is the part of this story that I think will hit the hardest for a lot of people listening right now. I packed everything I owned into the back of a rented van and drove for 6 hours with the windows down and the quiet, electric certainty that I was leaving the problem behind me. New city, new apartment. New set of daily routines with no fingerprints from the old life on any of them. And for about 3 weeks, it actually felt like it was working. The air smelled different. The streets had a different rhythm. I would wake up in the morning and there would be this brief, clean moment before the familiar thoughts arrived, like the pause before a song you know too well starts playing again. And I would lie there in that pause and think, maybe this time, maybe this is the reset. And then, slowly and without drama, the furniture of my inner life started arriving. Not all at once, piece by piece. First the low-grade tension in the mornings. Then the particular way I would read a message from someone new and immediately start constructing what it probably really meant underneath what it said. Then the familiar habit of hovering at the edge of things, close enough to be technically present, but far enough back to feel safe. And one evening, sitting in a coffee shop I had started going to regularly, I looked up from my laptop and had the clearest, most deflating thought. This feels exactly like the place I left. Not the coffee shop, the feeling inside the coffee shop, the internal weather, the texture of my own presence in the room. Identical. I had moved the body 6 hours north and brought the observer along in carry-on luggage. And the observer had wasted no time reconstructing its preferred version of reality in the new location, using whatever raw material was available. New people cast in old roles. New situations filtered through old expectations. The set design was different. The script was word for word the same. And sitting there with a coffee going cold in front of me, which seemed to be becoming a theme, I understood something I could not understand. The loop is not a place. You cannot drive away from it. It is the lens itself. And the lens goes wherever the eyes go. So the question that had to follow was the only honest one left. If the loop is not in the environment, and it is not in the circumstances, and it is not something that geography or fresh starts or new people can dissolve, then what actually can? And I want to be precise here, because I had tried a version of an answer to that question before, and it had not worked. I had tried awareness in the intellectual sense, the kind where you read something, recognize yourself in it, nod along, feel temporarily illuminated, and then walk straight back into the same patterns 48 hours later. That kind of awareness is real, but it is shallow. It touches the surface of the loop without disturbing the root, and the root is where this whole thing lives. What I had not tried was the kind of awareness that is willing to be uncomfortable, the kind that does not just observe the thought, but stays in the room with it long enough to ask where it came from, the kind that can feel the pull of the old pattern activating in real time, that physical tug toward the familiar response, and choose to pause instead of follow. Not fight, not suppress, just pause. And in that pause, actually look, not at the content of the thought, but at the fact that it arrived, at the speed of it, at how automatic it was, at how little of you was actually involved in generating it, because that quality of attention is a completely different instrument than the one most of us use when we think we are being self-aware. Most self-awareness is still operating inside the story. It is the narrator commenting on the plot without ever stepping outside the narrative frame. What I am describing is stepping outside the frame entirely. And the first time I genuinely did that, not as a concept but as an actual lived moment, something strange happened that I did not expect and could not have predicted. I was in the middle of the exact kind of situation that usually triggered my most reliable pattern. The kind where I would normally feel that familiar drop in the stomach, that quick internal calculation of what was about to go wrong, that bracing. And instead of following the calculation, I just watched it start, like watching a match being struck without the flame catching. And in that watching, the thought did not grow. It did not compound into the next thought and the next. It arrived, sat there for a moment, and then quietly dissolved. And the silence that followed it was unlike anything I had experienced before. Not empty, full, like a room that had been cleared of furniture you had forgotten was making it feel small. And I knew, standing in that silence, that something had just cracked open. But I also knew I had barely scratched the surface of what that crack was going to reveal. The worst thing you can do when you finally see the loop clearly is to make it your new obsession. And that is exactly what I did. For about 2 months after that first crack opened in the coffee shop, I became a dedicated, almost compulsive student of my own patterns. I tracked them. I journaled about them. I brought them up in conversations with anyone willing to listen. And every time I caught the loop activating, I would feel this small surge of satisfaction, like a hunter spotting movement in the trees. Look at that. There it is again. And the terrible irony, which took me an embarrassingly long time to recognize, was that all that hunting was itself a form of feeding. I had not stepped outside the loop. I had renovated it, given it a more sophisticated interior, dressed the same furniture in new language, and the loop ran happily on all that attention, just as it always had, completely indifferent to whether the attention was critical or admiring. Because here is the thing about attention that nothing in the self-help section ever told me directly. Attention does not have a moral preference. It does not reward good intentions or punish bad ones. It simply goes where it is pointed and organizes reality around that point. So when I was spending hours each week carefully examining, cataloging, and discussing my limitations, I was doing something that felt like healing but functioned like maintenance. I was watering the very thing I was trying to uproot. and the more emotionally charged that attention was, the more the patterns stabilized. Frustration with the loop is still attention on the loop. Fascination with the loop is still attention on the loop. And the loop, patient and structurally elegant, accepts all of it. The shift came from an unexpected direction. I was on a long walk one evening, the kind where you go out without headphones because something in you needs quiet, and I noticed that for about 20 minutes, I had not been thinking about any of this at all. I had been watching the light change on the surface of a puddle near a broken gutter. Just watching it, not analyzing what the watching meant, not turning it into a lesson, just genuinely there, in the specific texture of that ordinary moment. And when I eventually noticed that I had been genuinely present, my first instinct was to immediately think about why that mattered and what it proved about consciousness and perception. And then I caught that instinct, and I laughed, out loud, alone on a street next to a puddle, because the mind had tried to immediately convert a moment of actual freedom into more content for the loop to process. And seeing that move, seeing it happen in real time, was the clearest demonstration I had ever witnessed of how subtle and how fast the system operates. The loop does not need you to be stuck in misery. It just needs your attention. Any kind will do. And the moment you genuinely withdraw that attention, not by fighting it, but by simply finding something else more interesting, something real and immediate and sensory right in front of you, the loop has nothing to run on, and it quiets. Not permanently, not all at once, but genuinely, measurably, it quiets. And that quiet is not empty. It has a different quality than the silence of suppression. It feels like a room where something has been switched off that had been running so long you forgot it was consuming anything. And here is where it gets more complicated. Because just as I was beginning to understand how to stop feeding the loop with attention, a different mechanism activated that I had not fully accounted for. Something older and more physical than thought. And this is the part where the story takes a turn that I think will resonate with anyone who has ever made genuine progress toward change and then found themselves, inexplicably, retreating. Not because they failed, not because the insight was wrong, but because something deep inside them decided that the familiar was preferable to the unknown. Even when the familiar was quietly miserable and the unknown was genuinely open. I started noticing a physical sensation that preceded every significant retreat, a kind of low, spreading unease that had no specific object, not anxiety about something in particular, just a diffuse wrongness, like the air pressure changing before weather arrives. And every time that sensation showed up, my mind would immediately generate a reason for it, a problem to attach it to, a situation that needed managing, and I would spend energy on the manufactured problem without ever noticing that the unease had arrived first, before any of the content. The unease was not a response to the situation was a response to the unease. And the unease, I eventually understood, was the nervous system doing what nervous systems do when something they have relied on for years starts to feel unstable. Even when what is becoming unstable is the thing that was hurting you, even then, the system reaches for it, because it knows the shape of it. And the shape of suffering, when it is familiar enough, feels like solid ground. And what I did not yet understand was just how far that instinct was willing to go to protect itself. There was a specific week where I came closer to walking everything back than I have ever admitted to anyone. Not dramatically, not with a crisis or a breakdown. Just quietly, over the course of several ordinary days, I started gravitating back toward every habit I had spent months unwinding. I started filling silence with noise again, started shrinking decisions back down to the size the old version of me would have made them, started reinterpreting recent progress as probably just a phase, probably not as real as it felt, probably something I should not get too attached to. And the scariest part was how reasonable all of it sounded. Every retreat came with a perfectly logical explanation attached. I was being grounded. I was being realistic. I was not getting ahead of myself. And had anyone asked me that week how I was doing with everything, I would have said fine, still working on it, taking it one step at a time. And I would have believed myself completely. because the pull back toward the familiar does not feel like defeat. That is the part nobody warns you about. It feels like maturity. It feels like you are finally being honest with yourself instead of chasing something unrealistic. And that feeling is the most dangerous thing the system produces, because it wears the costume of wisdom so convincingly that you cannot tell it from the real thing without a very specific kind of attention. The kind that notices not just what you are thinking, but what you are moving away from while you think it. I remember the exact moment it became clear. I was standing in the kitchen again, same kitchen from the beginning of all this, and I was about to make a decision that 3 months earlier I would not have had to think about at all. A small thing, a professional opportunity that required me to show up differently than I was used to showing up, and I was in the process of constructing a very coherent reason to pass on it. The timing was not quite right. I was not fully prepared. There would be other chances, and I was mid-sentence in my own head when I felt it. That specific physical unease, that low spreading pressure in the chest that I had learned by then to recognize as the system defending its territory. And I stopped. Not because I was strong, because I was tired. Tired of how much energy that particular construction required. Tired of how elaborate the excuses had become. Tired of the sheer maintenance cost of keeping the old story structurally sound. And in that tiredness, there was something I had not expected. A kind of clarity that does not come from effort or insight, but from simply running out of the will to resist what you already know. And what I already knew was this. The discomfort I was feeling was not a warning. It was a threshold. And every threshold feels like a wall until you actually walk through it. From the outside, they are identical. The difference is only knowable from the other side. So I made the decision, not with confidence, with something quieter than confidence, a kind of flat, exhausted commitment that said, I am going through this one, regardless of how it feels, because I know now what the alternative costs. And on the other side of that decision, something shifted in the way things felt, not in the outcome, not immediately, but in the texture of being inside my own life, like a frequency adjustment, small but real, and impossible to ignore once you had felt it. And this is where I have to tell you about what coherence actually feels like from the inside, because I had always associated alignment with effort, with getting your thoughts in order, and your goals clearly defined, and your strategy properly structured. And what I discovered was that real coherence has almost none of that quality. It does not feel organized. It feels quiet. It feels like the difference between carrying a bag that is packed with things you definitely need and carrying a bag you packed in a hurry and have not opened in years. Both feel like your bag, but one of them is heavy in a way that has become so normal you stop noticing it was heavy at all. When I stopped contradicting myself internally, when what I genuinely felt and what I was willing to move toward started pointing in the same direction without negotiation, the quality of decisions changed completely. Not because I suddenly had more information or more confidence, but because there was no internal argument consuming energy in the background anymore. The signal got cleaner, and a clean signal, pointed at something real, moves through the world differently than a signal full of interference. Things that had felt effortful started feeling navigable, not easy, navigable. And that distinction matters more than most people realize, because navigable means you can actually move. And moving, after years of sophisticated stillness, felt like something I had almost forgotten was possible. And it was only the beginning of what was about to change. The first real sign that the loop was actually breaking was not what I expected, and I almost missed it entirely. It did not arrive as a triumph or a breakthrough moment or anything with the emotional weight that transformation is supposed to carry in the stories we tell about it. It arrived as a Tuesday morning with no particular quality to it, where I woke up and lay there for a few minutes and noticed that the usual internal weather had not rolled in yet. No anticipatory tension, no low hum of unfinished business pressing against the edges of consciousness, just a kind of unclaimed quiet that felt strange enough that I actually checked whether something was wrong. And nothing was wrong. The quiet was just quiet, and that had become so unfamiliar that my first response to it was suspicion. That detail still gets me when I think about it, that I had been living with so much internal noise for so long that its absence felt like a symptom, like something had malfunctioned, because the noise had been the baseline. It had been the proof that I was paying attention, that I was taking things seriously, that I was engaged with my life. And without it, I felt briefly unmoored, like a ship that has been fighting a current for years, and suddenly the current stops, and the crew does not know what to do with the stillness, because all their skill was developed around the fight. But I stayed with the quiet instead of filling it. That was the difference from every previous time something had briefly opened up. Before, I would have immediately reached for something to think about, something to plan, something to be usefully occupied with. This time I just let the morning be what it was, and in that space, something subtle but unmistakable started happening. I began noticing things that had been there all along, but that the noise had been drowning out. The way the light came through a specific gap in the curtains at a particular angle, the sound of the building settling around me, small, textural, real details of actual life that I had been moving through without registering for what felt like years, and each one of them felt, I do not have a better word for this, like information, like the world had been trying to communicate at a frequency I had been too loud internally to receive. And then things started arriving that I can only describe as a change in traffic, not in volume, but in quality. Conversations that opened something instead of confirming something already closed. A message from someone I had not heard from in a long time that led, through a chain of events I could not have engineered, to an opportunity that fit so precisely what I had been moving toward that it felt almost suspicious. And I noticed my instinct was still to reach for the suspicious interpretation first, still to ask what the catch was, but the instinct had lost most of its authority. It arrived, and I saw it, and I set it aside, and I moved forward anyway. And the forward motion itself was different, lighter, less like pushing through resistance, and more like walking on a surface that had finally dried out after being soft for a very long time. I want to be careful here about what I am and am not saying. I am not saying the world became magical. I am not saying that all problems dissolved, or that difficulty disappeared. What changed was the relationship between me and whatever was happening. The same kinds of situations that had previously required enormous internal negotiation were now just situations, things to move through rather than battles to survive. And that shift in texture, that qualitative difference in what it felt like to be inside my own life, was more significant than any single external change could have been. Because external changes come and go, but a shift in the quality of your own perception, that compounds. And here's where I have to tell you about what happened with emotion during this period. Because I had assumed, somewhere in the back of my thinking, that as the loop loosened, feeling things would become easier in the sense of less intense, that without the amplification of the old pattern, things would land more softly. And the opposite was true. Things landed more fully. The difference was that they moved. A difficult conversation would produce something real and sharp and present, and then it would pass, the way weather passes, without leaving a residue that needed managing for the next several days. And something good would land with a clarity and a completeness that I had not been able to access before, because before there was always a part of me half waiting for the other shoe to drop. That half-waiting posture had cost me more than I had ever calculated, not just in chronic low-level tension, but in actual presence. I had been there for my own life, in the way you are there for a film you have seen before, and are watching again out of habit, going through the motions of attention without genuine contact. And now the contact was back, and it was startling in the best and most disorienting way possible. And it was about to show me something about how I had been spending my energy that I was not fully prepared to see. I had been spending the majority of my available energy on a job I had not applied for, and nobody was paying me to do. The job of managing how things might go wrong. And I did not see it as a job because it had never felt like a choice. It felt like vigilance, like the responsible adult thing that serious people do when they have been through enough to know that things can turn. But what I understood now, with the kind of clarity that only arrives after the noise drops, was that all of that vigilance had a price tag, and the price was presence. Every unit of energy spent pre-living a negative future was a unit not available for the actual present moment, and I had been running that deficit for so long that I had genuinely forgotten what it felt like to be fully inside my own life without a part of me standing guard at the door. The thing that finally made this visible was a conversation with someone I had known for years, a person I genuinely trusted, who said something so simple it almost felt like an insult at first. She said, "You know what I notice about you lately? You seem like you are actually here. And I asked what she meant, and she said, "Before, talking to you felt like talking to someone who was also simultaneously in 3 other conversations in their head, like you were present but distributed, and now you are just here, and that is different." That was the whole sentence. That is different. And I drove home afterward with those 2 words taking up more space in my thinking than anything else that day, because she was right. And the fact that she could see it from the outside before I could fully feel it from the inside told me something important about how invisible the old state had been even to me. And from that presence, things that had previously felt like separate problems started resolving with very little effort on my part. Not because I had found better strategies, or worked harder, or finally figured out the right approach, but because most of those problems had been downstream of the same source, the loop. The constant interference of a system running predictions in the background, filtering every situation through expectations that were years out of date, steering decisions away from openness and toward the familiar narrow path. And when the loop quieted, the downstream cleared, not all at once, not without effort in specific moments, but in the way a river clears when you remove the thing that was blocking it upstream. The water does not have to try. It just moves the way it was always going to move if nothing had been in the way. Relationships found their natural level. Some deepened in ways I had not expected because I was no longer managing them from behind a layer of protective distance. Some fell away quietly, not through conflict, but through honest incompatibility that I had previously been too defended to acknowledge. Work began aligning with what I was actually good at and genuinely interested in. Not because I made sweeping changes, but because my decisions started coming from a clearer place, and clearer decisions lead somewhere different than clouded ones. And the future, which had for most of my adult life felt like a landscape full of things to navigate around, started feeling like something I was simply moving into, without bracing, without the constant background calculation of what might go wrong. And I want to be honest about what this is not. It is not a permanent state of peace. It is not freedom from difficulty or discomfort or the ordinary weight of being a person in the world. The loop still activates sometimes. Old patterns still surface. The difference is that they no longer have automatic authority. They arrive and I see them, and I have a choice that I did not previously experience as a choice. And that gap, that small but real space between stimulus and my response to it, is where everything actually lives. It is where I live now. And it is a completely different address from the one I occupied for most of my life. And here is what all of this came down to in the end. You are not stuck because life is against you, or because you were dealt a difficult hand, or because change is genuinely impossible for someone like you. You are stuck because you have been an extraordinarily faithful witness to a story that stopped being true a long time ago. And the story does not need to be fought. It does not need to be dismantled piece by piece with enormous effort and willpower. It needs to be seen clearly. Because a story that is seen clearly, really seen, with no part of you still invested in its being true, loses the one thing that kept it running. Your agreement. And the moment you withdraw that agreement, even quietly, even partially, reality does not wait for permission to respond. It already is responding. It has always been responding. The only question is what you are asking it to reflect. So here is what I want to ask you directly, and I want you to sit with this before you answer. What is the one story about yourself that you have been treating as a fact for so long that you have completely stopped questioning it? Not a big dramatic belief. The quiet one. The one that sounds like common sense. The one that arrives before you even notice it has arrived. What is it? And how different would your life look if that story simply was not true anymore? Drop your answer in the comments below, because I genuinely want to know. And if this reached something in you today, leave a like and subscribe, because there is a lot more where this came from, and you do not want to miss what comes next.